Okay, good evening and welcome to everyone who is joining us. My name is Anna Barber and I'm the Manager of Exhibitions and Programs here at the Martha's Vineyard Museum. With Thanksgiving approaching next week, we, like so many, are thinking critically about the holiday and how we engage in a deeper discussion around this complicated historical myth. In this story that many generations of Americans grew up hearing, there were no Wampanoag people until the Pilgrims encountered them 400 years ago. And they participated in that story only as supporting characters in a larger narrative. But that is not the truth. As I join you tonight from my home on Martha's Vineyard, I want to acknowledge the Wampanoag people whose stewardship over this island, their homeland, stretches back thousands of years. They remain strong today and their resiliency will continue into the future. I want to warmly welcome our two guests for this evening's program. David Vanderhoop, who is an Aquinnah Wampanoag, was born and raised here on the island. David co-founded Sassafras Earth Education, a nonprofit organization located on Wampanoag ancestral lands. He has organized and facilitated webinars and conferences on topics like decolonization, truth and history, cultural appropriation, racism, and acknowledging the role of First People in outdoor education and beyond. David is recognized in his Wampanoag community as a leader and holder of Wampanoag history, knowledge, and legends. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Anna.
And David Silverman is professor of history at George Washington University. He is the author of several books on Native American, colonial American, and American racial history, including the phenomenal new book that came out last year, This Land is Their Land, The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving, along with Thundersticks, Firearms, and the Violent Transformation of Native America. He is the recent recipient of the William Hickling Prescott Award for Excellence in Historical Writing, given by the Massachusetts branch of the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, and the Daily Beast. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
And before we begin, I want to just give a quick overview of how this program will run this evening. We will start with David Vanderhoop, who will be sharing with us an expression of gratitude and acknowledgement. Then David and David will together give an overview and discussion of the first Thanksgiving and the context around it. This portion of the program will last around 40 minutes or so. Following that, David Vanderhoop will take us on a processing journey, after which we will open it up to questions from all of you. So at any time during this discussion, please post your questions in the chat or the Q&A. And I will direct them to our guests at that point. We have 167 participants right now with us, so we will try to get to as many of the questions as we can. We'll have about 20 to 25 minutes for questions, so I hope we can get through a lot of them. After that is over, David Vanderhoop is going to offer some closing remarks and thoughts on how we can all move forward together. I want to thank you all of you again for being here. And with that, I would like to hand it over to David Vanderhoop.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate you and holding the space for us today to gather and to share. And I wanted to say that I'm I'm very thankful today for waking up today to this beautiful day, for this land, for the island, Noepe, now known as Martha's Vineyard. I'm thankful for health and resilience of the Wampanoag people. I'm thankful for all of the creatures on the land that live. I'm thankful for the waters above us, below us, that surround us, that we can just drink from and harvest from. I'm thankful for the trees and for family and love and for this Wampanoag territory that we're all on. And I want to acknowledge that the Wampanoag territory of Noepe, that we are still here. I want to acknowledge the thousands of Wampanoag people that used to roam this land freely. And I want to acknowledge the lore and the words passed down to make an understanding of history and of myself, of our people. And I'm very thankful for that and for all of those, all that notion that we are here and we will remain here on Noepe into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, David. I'm grateful to be here, and honored to be here as a guest of the Vineyard Museum, and to be sharing the stage tonight with my friend and colleague, David Vanderhoop. I want to acknowledge from the outset that I'm not Wampanoag, and that my perspective on the events that we're going to be talking about tonight is the perspective of a historian, not that of a Wampanoag person. And so I think it's particularly important here to have a Wampanoag perspective represented alongside my own. Anna asked me to begin tonight by reflecting on how the traditional first Thanksgiving story is a myth. And in order to set the stage for doing that, I first want to share with the audience here how I came to this subject. 15 years ago, it's hard to believe it was 15 years ago, but it was. 15 years ago, I published my first book about the Vineyard Wampanoags. And it built on the better part of 10 years of research, mostly on the island of Martha's Vineyard, in its various wonderful local and county archives, and not least of all in the collections of the Vineyard Museum. And I need to offer thanks to the Vineyard Museum staff from that era of effectively giving me free reign of the place, which allowed me to discover uncatalogued documents that proved to be quite illuminating. But a big part of that project involved engagement with modern Wampanoag people who had their own stories to tell, their own perspectives on the history in which I was interested in. And among the subjects that came up repeatedly in my conversations with Wampanoag people was how hard Thanksgiving season was for them, and how hard it was particularly for them as children and for their own children once they became parents, about how they had to sit through these annual recitations of the first Thanksgiving myth that they knew was laden with untruths, that they knew was a lie, and that almost invariably those untruths would be followed with yet another whopper, which was that the Wampanoags and other New England Native people were all gone, that they no longer existed. And so, it seemed to me that it was important to address that hurt in a historical way, which was by holding up the mythic Thanksgiving to the truth of the actual history. There was another reason that I decided to write this book as well, and that is that I've been working with secondary and primary school social studies and history teachers every summer for the better part of 20 years now, helping them to bone up on their content knowledge for the classroom. And to a person, they would tell me that they had the responsibility of teaching the story of the first Thanksgiving every November, and they felt completely ill-equipped to do so in a three-dimensional holistic way. And so it seemed to me that there was another opportunity here to reach a wide public that needed to be reached with this story. So let me tell you how I've approached that history. I contend that the Thanksgiving myth is just that. It's a myth. It's not history. There is an element of truth to it, of course. The English of Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag people of the mainland did indeed get together for a few days in the fall of 1621 and feast together. And they allied with one another politically. But almost every other element of the first Thanksgiving myth, as we've come to know it, is false. And it certainly lacks context. So what I'd like to do is lay out for you what I consider to be the essential prehistory to that mythic first Thanksgiving, and then the equally essential post-history to that mythic Thanksgiving, which takes us up to this very day. Without that before and after context, we can't understand both the significance and the insignificance of that so-called first Thanksgiving. So let's start with this basic premise, that when the Mayflower arrived off of southern New England in December of 1620, this was not a new world nor a wilderness, though those are the terms that the colonists used to refer to America. And those are terms that many Americans to this very day use to refer to the place at that particular moment in time. The Americas was not a new world in any way, shape, or form. It was an old one, no less than any other continent on the face of the globe. It was a place where human beings had lived for thousands and thousands of years, creating civilizations. The place was not a wilderness, it was full of human civilizations. And so just by acknowledging how the terms New World and wilderness blind us to the human richness of this place at the moment of contact between Europeans and Native people, we open up new vantages on this Thanksgiving story. It's also critical to note that the arrival of the Mayflower was no first contact episode between Wampanoag people and Europeans, though the Thanksgiving myth often suggests that it was. Wampanoag people had been in contact with Europeans for at least a century before the arrival of the Mayflower. The first documented case of contact between Wampanoag people and Europeans, and let's always remember that just because something is the first case of being documented doesn't mean it's the first case, it just means it's the first case on record. The first case on record is 1524, with the arrival of the French-employed Italian sailor Giovanni da Verrazzano in Narragansett Bay. Contacts took place intermittently between Europeans and Wampanoag people for the better part of the next 80 years. But from 1602 to 1620, contacts between the Wampanoags and a variety of European people, English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and others, were annual events. And indeed, there would often be several contacts per summer between 1602 and 1620. Now, both parties were drawn to one another by the desire for trade. Europeans had a store of metal goods and brightly colored cloth and glass beads. Wampanoag people had various furs and fresh food, and both parties wanted what the other had. But almost invariably, these trading contacts degenerated into violence. And not uncommonly, Europeans would take advantage of this breakdown of relations to capture, to kidnap Wampanoag and other Native people of southern New England. They would transport them across the seas, and as often as not, sell them into slavery in places like Spain or Tangier, or would bring them back to European capitals for training as interpreters and guides for future voyages. Because of those abductions, Wampanoag people developed a real distaste for Europeans even before the arrival of the Mayflower passengers. They associated these people with treachery, with violence, with ferrying away their loved ones to an unknown fate across the ocean. They were not naive about these people, And all the more so because at least two Wampanoag people, at least two, managed to make it back from Europe to Wampanoag country before the arrival of the Mayflower. One of them was from Martha's Vineyard. His name was Aquinnah. He lived in London for years, learned English, and tricked the English into bringing him home because he told them he could lead them to gold on the island. Those of you on the island know there's no natural gold on the island. Another one was the famous Squanto, who served as the interpreter and political go-between between Wampanoag people and the English. Originally, the English had sold him into slavery in Spain, and through just this remarkable train of events, it's almost too remarkable to believe. Some Spanish friars freed him before he was sold away. He managed to make contact with the English merchant community in the Spanish city of Malaga. The English merchant community took him to London. He came into the possession of a prime mover of American colonial schemes, traveled from London to Newfoundland, back to London, back to Newfoundland, back to London, and then eventually made his way back to Wampanoag country about 6 months before the arrival of the Mayflower. Squanto, or Tisquantum, as Wampanoags called him, had seen more of the world than most of the passengers on the Mayflower. Long story short, these Wampanoag people who greeted the English of the Mayflower were not the least bit naive about who these people were. They knew exactly who they were. They knew where they came from. They indeed, some of them even knew the sponsors of the Mayflower voyage. There's another essential prehistory to this meeting between the Wampanoags and the English of the Mayflower, and that is this terrible epidemic disease that devastated southeastern New England between the years 1616 and 1619. We don't know the identity of the disease. It was certainly introduced by Europeans, but we don't know what it was called. Contemporary Europeans who were active on the southern New England coast during these years, they include, among others, John Smith of Virginia fame, they called this disease a plague. They didn't mean the plague, like the bubonic plague of the 14th century. When they said plague, it effectively meant epidemic. So we don't know what it was. I suspect it was smallpox. It's hard to say. But here's what we know. It devastated interlinked Native communities, communities that traded together, intermarried together, socialized with one another, between southern Maine, from the Saco River Valley, all the way southwest to the east shore of Narragansett Bay, devastating Abenaki people, Massachusetts people, and Wampanoag people. The disease appears to have halted at the border between the Wampanoags and their Narragansett rivals to the west. The depopulation was enormous. We don't know the exact numbers, but we do know in some communities, doesn't mean all, but in some communities, Native people said they had lost 9/10 of their population. So it's a good bet that the Wampanoags had lost at least half of their population overall, and perhaps a great deal more. The Narragansetts took advantage of Wampanoag weakness to try to reduce them to the status of tributaries. And then the Mayflower arrived. All of a sudden, the paramount Wampanoag sachem, or the great Wampanoag sachem or chief, Usamequin, the English knew him by his title, Massasoit. That's like Mr. President. Barack Obama's name was not Mr. President, that's his title. His name was Barack Obama. Usamequin's title was Massasoit, and that's how the English referred to him. He had a choice to make. What do you do with these people? He knew that these people came from a society whose sailors had a record of incredible violence in southern New England, who were treacherous, who were dangerous. At the same time, he was under enormous pressure from the Narragansetts. He did not want to be tributaries to them. So he decided to take a gamble and reach out to these people, hoping that if he made an alliance with them, he could harness the power of their firearms, their swords, and their hatchets, and their soldiers to help maintain his authority among the Wampanoag people and the Wampanoag people's independence from the Narragansetts. There are trace pieces of evidence throughout the colonists' own historic record that there was a great deal of Wampanoag opposition to this decision. Some Wampanoag people wanted to wipe this place out. He said, this is too dangerous a gamble. There's no telling what allowing these people to live among the Wampanoag people will become. But Usamikun took the gamble, and he really had to stamp out some domestic opposition to this decision in order to do it. He took the gamble, and that's how we end up with this alliance between the Wampanoags and the English. Two parties reach out to one another, they start to trade with one another, they make a mutual defense pact that the English will come to the Wampanoags' defense if they need it, and probably more importantly, that the Wampanoags would come to the English defense if they needed it. And here I think it's important to note, Plymouth Colony was a small and insignificant place. There were about 100 Mayflower passengers when the ship landed in southern New England. Several months later, only 50 of them were left. And most of them were not men in any shape to fight. The Wampanoags outnumbered the English of Plymouth Colony by a factor of 20 or more. So, let's always keep in mind, the Wampanoags could have wiped out this place if they decided to do so. They decided not to do so. After many back and forth exchanges, diplomacy, mutual visiting, trading, and some acts of mutual defense, the English managed to survive through a terrible winter and through their first harvest, and decided that they were going to celebrate with a few days of leisure, feasting, manly exercise, sport, and the like. As part of these festivities, they started firing off their guns, whereupon Usamikun and 90 Wampanoag men, armed, showed up at Plymouth Colony, probably believing, as Wampanoags tell today, that the place was under attack, either by the French or by the Narragansetts, and good to their word, the Wampanoags showed up to help. When it turned out that there was no emergency, the Wampanoags stayed, and the two people feasted together for the next several days. Neither side attributed much importance to this event. The Wampanoags never invoked it again, at least on record, in any diplomacy between themselves and the English. And let me emphasize, when Native people thought an event was important in a relationship between two groups, they would, as a matter of routine, invoke it at the beginning of diplomacy. They would say, do you remember back when we did the following? They never did this with Thanksgiving. English records dedicated 2 paragraphs to it. And so, yeah, we had a feast, Native people contributed some venison, we had fowl and eels and shellfish and the like. The English didn't see this as all that significant. So we'll get back in a little bit to how this first Thanksgiving, if you will, became so mythically important. So I've laid out the prehistory to this event. Let's talk just for a moment about the post-history. The mythic Thanksgiving would have us believe that Indigenous people, friendly for no apparent reason. We've laid out the reasons that they welcome the English, but Indigenous people who are friendly for no apparent reason welcome the English to their lands and then effectively grant them their country so that the United States can emerge from the colonies as a beacon of democracy, religious freedom, and Christianity and opportunity. This is a whitewashed story of bloodless colonialism in which no crime is done, in which no blood is shed, in which no one is enslaved, in which no land is stolen. But that's not how the story played out in southern New England, or for that matter, anywhere else in North America. Colonialism was and is a bloody business, a business of exploitation. And that was true in the case of the relationship between Plymouth and the Wampanoags, no less than anywhere else. In the short term, Usamequin's gamble was right. He managed to fend off the Narragansetts and maintain his independence from them. In the long term, it was the wrong gamble because his people lost their independence to the English. You know, there's this old Wampanoag joke that I've been told that, boy, good thing for the English, or we'd all be speaking Narragansett now, right? Which really speaks to the exact point. Once Massachusetts was founded as a colony and thousands of English people began streaming into the region and reproducing like rabbits. I mean, the average woman of childbearing age is giving birth to 8 children over the course of her life. In 17th century New England, the English population just explodes and began overrunning indigenous people who continued to struggle with epidemic diseases. There was another epidemic in 1622, another one in 1633, another one in 1643, another in 1645, and you see where I'm going. Over time, the English forced native people to cede them land, cheat them out of other land, drive them into debt as they're appropriating native resources, and then start trying to enslave native people as payment for those debts. The English began expanding their jurisdiction over native people, including trying to interfere in what they considered to be crimes between native people within native territory. And they launched missions, Christian missions to native people, which disrupted the normal political structures of native society, encouraging native people who became Christians to cut off their tribute payments to great sachems like Usamequin and then his sons, Wamsutta, or Alexander as the English called him, and Pometacom, or Metacomet, who the English called King Philip. By the 1660s, these tensions were coming to a head, and one sees numerous war scares between the Wampanoags and the English, characterizing the 50 years after the treaty between the English and the Wampanoags in 1621 as a period of peace is really a mischaracterization. It's a period that is marked by exploitation and constant war scares. And eventually, Usamequin's son, Pometacom, decides to lead a multi-tribal coalition against the English in 1675 and 76. Not all native people flocked to his standard. Some of them judged, even if they sympathized with his goals, that it was too late, that this was going to be a losing effort. Wampanoag people on the Cape and on Martha's Vineyard did not fight against the English in King Philip's War. That's part of why they're still here today. Many Wampanoag people on the mainland did, alongside Narragansetts, Nipmucks, Sakokis, Pecumtucks, and others. And though they got the best of it at first, ultimately they went down to a devastating defeat, in which most of them were killed, in which the English enslaved thousands of them, and selling most of them overseas, and in which others scattered to the Hudson River Valley or the St. Lawrence River Valley. To the extent that history instructors address the Wampanoags after the so-called First Thanksgiving, they usually end with King Philip's War. I contend in my book that reckoning with the First Thanksgiving as a white lie also means carrying this history all the way up to this present day, addressing the various ways that the colonists and their white successors cheated native people out of their land, drove them into debt peonage and servitude, forced them to adopt white behaviors in order to survive, and then tried to define them away out of history through stories like the Thanksgiving myth, which whitewashed the bloodiness of colonial American history, which made it seem like a sanitized process, a process destined and blessed by God so that the United States could emerge as a beacon to the world. Now, interestingly, the Thanksgiving myth didn't get attached to the Thanksgiving holiday until the 1840s, which is more than 2 centuries after the actual event. It's in the 1840s that the Reverend Alexander Young published the primary source account of this feast. And to it, he added a footnote. Let me tell you, as a historian, there aren't a lot of famous footnotes in history. This is one of them. And the footnote he added to this 2-paragraph description of the feast was, this was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England. Well, after that, orators, Ralph Waldo Emerson, John Quincy Adams, and others disseminated the idea until it became widely held throughout American society. By the time Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving to be a national holiday in 1863, the rest of the country was ready to take this myth and attach it to the holiday. And I say it was ready in the 1860s for a couple of different reasons. One is that white Protestants were deeply afraid in the 1860s that the country was being overrun by immigrants. Yes, this is a recurring theme in American history. In this particular case, they were afraid of Catholic immigrants, mostly from Ireland and Germany. Later, they became spooked by Jewish and Christian Orthodox immigrants from Eastern Europe. The Thanksgiving myth made white Protestant ancestors the founding fathers of America. It made their quest for freedom of conscience the template for colonial American history, as opposed to what I consider to be the main characteristics of colonial history, which are colonial native wars and slavery. The country was also ready for the myth at this time because the United States was in the latter stages of subjugating the tribes of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountain West. Up to this point, most white Americans characterized indigenous people as bloodthirsty savages. With the end of those wars, the white majority was ready to give Native people an unthreatening role in the national myth. And then finally, New Englanders were especially enthusiastic about this myth because it made their region seem the exception to the darker sides of colonial American history. In particular, it distanced New England from Reconstruction in the South, the so-called Black problem, and it distanced New England from the Indian Wars of the West, the so-called Indian problem. In New England, this story everything went fine. Native people and colonists made friends, and the two lived happily ever after. What happened to the natives? No one knew. But of course, it was manifest destiny for white people to possess the continent and for indigenous people to disappear through natural processes. We have been inculcated with that myth over the generations by schools teaching it to young people, by having them perform in Thanksgiving pageants, by having them make cardboard or construction paper cutouts of happy Indians and pilgrims holding hands. Through our homes and businesses, sporting decorations with similar themes. Through the endless repetition of this lie. And I'll just close with this observation and then turn things back over to David. Almost any reasonable adult, I realize there are many unreasonable adults out there, but almost any reasonable adult with whom I've talked, even if they don't know much history, when I say to them, do you really think a shared meal is a proper symbol of indigenous European relations in colonial America? Almost to a person they'll say, no. They don't know why, they don't know the details, but they will readily acknowledge that that's probably not an appropriate symbol for their relations. And then I follow up with the question, so why do we keep telling it over and over again? Why do we keep teaching our kids this nonsense? And that's something I hope we'll all reflect on together here as we move forward with the conversation. So I'll leave it at that before the big hook comes out. Turn things over to my friend David Vanderhoop. You need to unmute, David.
There we are. Thank you for that, David. I appreciate, your research and your knowledge and your sharing. It's very rare for me to actually be able to speak to someone or speak to someone who has knowledge that of the real history of the truth in history that that reflects, you know, what you have said and understands the position that I feel that I'm in constantly and have been having to live between these two worlds in this Western culture and so on and so forth. So I appreciate the words that you shared. Thank you very much. And one of those aspects of Thanksgiving that I would just interject right now is that is that during those times when the immigrants and the I guess the bounty hunters, as well as the that first initial armies that were sent out to annihilate the natives of the land, they had and was called and is documented a Thanksgiving feast after their, you know, after their annihilation and devastation of each battle that they survived on, and that they killed our women and children and elders, and that were like just defenseless at the moment and in time. And I won't go any deeper than that, but they did have that Thanksgiving feast, and that's what they called it.
Mhm.
And I just am appalled by history, but it is history, and I have to live today and deal with that. And I will say that Noepe, right here where I sit, now known as Martha's Vineyard, is our territory, is Wampanoag territory. We, the Wampanoag people, still are here. And we will remain. And I want to just invite all to just listen deeply and to understand that this is an uncomfortable conversation to have. Not only for you, it's uncomfortable for me as well. Simply because I'm Wampanoag, and it's been just taught to me and engraved in me since I was bussed out of Gay Head, which is now Aquinnah, to Down Island, to make sure that I knew that I was different. I was not a human being. I was different. I was a dumb Indian. I was from not where they were from. And today, I represent myself as Wampanoag man. I speak for myself. I don't speak for the administration of the Wampanoag people. I don't speak for, all of my tribe. But to a degree, I do represent my people in my heart. So in order to really wrap your mind around this, early written history is written by white people when they came here and through their lens, although, you know, it is what they saw, it's not what the Native people, they couldn't see into Native people's hearts, into the Wampanoag people's hearts. But we were pushed to that point because of what Dave has explained to you with the death, the disease that happened during the years from 1615 to 1619. So we were at the limits of our, you know, our being, not knowing what was killing all of us. And that can give you a sense of desperation from Usamiquin, from our people. And I think that even though the Wampanoag people here on the island went on to do their own business, they were affected as well, big time. Thousands of natives here on the Vineyard fell prey to this disease. And that fear that was instilled in our hearts at that time, where we didn't know, we had no clue of what was going on, just like laid that blanket out for the immigrants to come and to see this as what they saw as open land, free land that nobody, you know, desired, that was theirs for the taking. And for the survivors of that disease, for the survivors that were here, remaining in the fear that was brought down on them through not a notion of what our people could have thought of in the prior years, really worked in their favor. So let me just sketch a little picture of, you know, of what it may have been like before that, where those thousands of Wampanoags here on the Vineyard were. They had their trails, they had their, you know, their seasonal villages that they'd move from here to there with. They had their families and their warriors, understanding that, yeah, we live on an island surrounded by the ocean, by these waters that protect us. And that when those incidences happen to come, you know, not very frequently, where people tried to come in and tried to just like take part of our kin away, or thought that they, you know, could just come and do things that were not, you know, were like not, well, they could come and take our people. That wasn't happening because we would rise up and we would protect ourselves. And it wasn't that hard to do because we lived here. Noepe, land surrounded by water. So we were known as a force to reckon with. And so we were good for a very long time. 20, well, not long time, 20 years after, after the Mayflower and the Pilgrims came, until 1940, when Thomas Mayhew bought Noepe for 40 shillings. And the rest is history. And I can talk about that with you all later on. I won't go into what happened before then, but you can just imagine, and I've talked about it before. So that lifestyle did come to an end. And my ancestors knew that. My ancestors knew what was coming because they were tuned in, because they were spiritually aware for a long time before this happened. It is said that lore passed down, that prophecy passed down, where we will be overrun by people, light-skinned people, and there will be many deaths. So we knew that it was coming. We did the best we could with it. I am so thankful that I'm here today and I can call myself an ancestor from those maybe 5% that survived. Jumping forward, but the remnants of my people and their culture that they had was still here when I grew up, in the blueberry fields that I didn't even realize were taken care of, but they were just there for me when I was a child, and I would just be able to fill baskets and buckets with blueberries without having to crawl through briars or anything. The common lands where the cranberries grow were filled with us because they had been taken care of by my people. The Three Sisters Gardens that were the remnants of were on East Pasture, where we had our agricultural society and people that were able to grow and understand that this is the way we survive. When I was young, the houses without electricity, without telephones, without plumbing, everybody had an outhouse. Everybody knew how to act. Herring Creek was there. We knew to go there during certain times of year when I was young. And that was a place of community. West Basin, Gayhead side of Menemsha. The only way to get there was to walk. So I walked. I walked to the Herring Creek. I walked to the West Basin. I walked to the South Shore. It was that season where that was still available to me. Walking through the woods, following the streams, being free. And it wasn't until I was bused down island in the 5th grade that I encountered like who I was and the negativity around it. Fights on the playground, sending to the principal's office, teachers berating me, scolding me in front of all of the other students for asking for something that would challenge me more than that they were giving, because I had done the work in prior years. That was my introduction to the outside world. Even living up here in what's now known as Aquinnah, even living up here in Gayhead, being bused to Vineyard Haven. That was my introduction to the outside world where I was not welcome. And being raised in a traditional family where hunting and gathering was still the way we had to survive, because money in those 50s and 60s, in those years, was very scarce. Being raised in that way, being sitting alongside the road with the berries that I had gathered, with the jams from those berries that my mom had made, selling those, bringing that money to my household, was how we survived. So that was, a historical part of my upbringing. And I didn't realize how much of an effect that had on me until I was an adult. Except around that Thanksgiving, when my teacher, Helen Manning, told me the truth and didn't have us act out that Thanksgiving bull that everybody else around was doing. She told us, and she let us know that it was us, our people, that helped these immigrants to survive, and didn't go into detail about what they did to us, because she was a positive person. And she wanted just to have us have that pride that, yes, we helped. And that's how we survived. So this holiday coming up is, like, as David said, more of the origin of the United States than what it is portrayed to be. And for us Wampanoag people, it's the beginning of the genocide, the dispossession of land, and the constant warfare that had brought on us for us to defend ourselves and our families from 1607 to the present day. And not going into all the holidays that the United States goes in, I'll just add one more. Independence Day, July 4th. That day gave the non-Indigenous people of this land the right and the notion that it's okay to be a people of a genocidal regime under the guise of democracy that gave them the license to kill all of the Indigenous people of this land. And the world saw it, asked no questions, and turns a blind eye time and time again. And it's very, very still hard for me to come to an understanding that good people, that humans can, could do this, and not acknowledge that the truth is different. So all of these lies around the mythology of the origin of the United States is really hurtful to Indigenous people, and especially hurtful to the Wampanoag people. So if you can imagine yourself in my shoes, having to do and see and go through the things that I have gone through, and feel that historic trauma that's still somewhere in my being, in my spirit, still lies, and how it has affected me throughout my life. And I come to today. I come back to today, and I want to give. I still have, you know, the breath in me that wants to give. Number one, to Wampanoag youth, to have them understand that they are more than what they think they are, and that I want to uplift them to a place where they have pride in themselves, number one, and to give their gift to our community, which they all have. And I've opened my doors not only to Wampanoag children, but the whole island community. And I'm so thankful for that. I'm thankful for when I see these kids come up to me, when I see them in town at the store or on, you know, on the main streets of the towns down island, and come up to me and say, thank you for, you know, for what you did for me and open my eyes. That makes it all worthwhile. Why am I doing this? I'm doing this to restore the balance, to help my young brothers and sisters understand their values and their gift to contribute to our existence on Noepe and throughout Turtle Island. Sassafras Earth Education is what I've been doing for the last 20 years. Nature connection mentoring is the way that I give back to our people and to the young people of this island. The teen leadership program at Sassafras, land culture that we started, and now collaborating with the Native Land Conservancy to continue the decolonization process is what I'm involved with. And it's time now for people, like all of you people that joined today and more, to understand that it's time to start giving back to what has been stolen, taken by force, under the threat of death and worse, and worse. It's time to start giving back. And if you reach deep down inside your heart, I just know that truth that I see from the parents that bring their kids here to Sassafras, that they understand it's time to be truthful and do what they can to make that amends, to bring the next generation into the understanding that they have a responsibility, not only to themselves and their family, but to this land, to this territory of the Wampanoag people and beyond. I'd like to say that the spiritual beliefs that I have within me, leading me and other Wampanoag people who are courageous enough to walk the path of truth, that we have been sometimes chastised for not adhering to the norms of the white society, and from friends and even sometimes family. Knowing the truth of how we have been manipulated through the media, through education, makes me, as Wampanoag man, stay true to my destiny of decolonization and empowering my people to do the best that I can, and to join forums and groups with people like David Silverman, with the Native Land Conservancy, and with other people who see that this is how we're going to join together once again and be proud of who we are standing on this native territory, because we've done the right thing, we've said the right thing, we have our thoughts and our hearts in the right place. And I want to thank you for this time and listening. And I'd like to invite my daughter Nanawi to bring us together for a moment, if that's possible. Savannah. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just having an issue for a second because it wasn't allowing me to unmute. Hi, everyone. Thank you both for those beautiful words that you shared. And thank you all for being on the call and being open to hear these truths, even though they're not the most easy truths to hear. They're definitely necessary in order for us to grow and to eventually come into unification together. So I just want to say, I want to give acknowledgement to all of the people, all of the men, women, children, sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, elders, grandmothers, grandfathers, souls, and spirits who didn't ever get a chance to grow up on their land, grow up on the land that they knew, grow up in connection with Mama Earth, like I did. I grew up on my great-grandfather's land, who was able to save our land. And it's never been out of the hands of a Wampanoag person. So it's always been treated in a sacred way. And I just feel so grateful every single day to have had that opportunity to grow up on my own land and know that connection. So I want to give acknowledgement to that. I just want to take a deep breath. If everyone would join me. Just in. I want to give gratitude today for this beautiful day and for truth and love and unification. I'm going to sing my song, I Am My Spirit, which has Wampanoag words in there. So it's fitting. We ain't got no reparations. We are taking back our power. I will tell you the truth right now. We've been lied to. We've been lied to. We've been killed. Our culture was stolen. When will we return? Remember that you are me and I am you and we are everything. Remember that our roots are delicate, yin yang, all the elements. Blessed by the light of the sun to make us grow. Blessed by the beautiful waters to make us know, to pass on to the seeds we may sow. Aho. Kadabadanamu. I am grateful for you, my spirit. I am my spirit, and I remember that I am. I am grandfather's son and grandmother moon. The world is waiting for you. Ooh, la la lum lum la 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 lum lum la 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 lum lum 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 la 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 la. Get up and done the moon. I am grateful for you, my spirit. I am my spirit, and I remember that I am. Get up and done the moon. I am grandfather's son and grandmother moon. Mataak, mataak. Yuat wachi kino. Natasuis nanawi. Kitia hogao. Wamanitonk. Wanohtiaonk. Wahkakwashik. Ninyuat wuchiwami. Nikonahachik. Namanatumen. Nin Bawainan. Nanitskia, 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 Nanitskia. Katapatanamu, wea, hey, wea, hey. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nanawi. And just before we continue, I'd like everybody to just pause and take a moment. Take a moment in condolence for people of this land that were taken before their time. Take a moment to understand that condolence is what is necessary for us to move forward in a good way together, to bring our potential and our children's potential to become a better place, become better people, become what the Creator has in store for us and all beings of this planet. Kitab Tanamu. Anna.
Thank you all for that. And Nanawe, it was really nice to see and hear your beautiful voice again. Thank you for joining us. We do have a few questions that came through in our last, excuse me, 15 minutes or so together. I'd like to start with a question that was submitted from a student here. If we don't celebrate Thanksgiving as we do today, what should we do?
Well, let me just say this. Yeah, I don't think anyone, Wampanoag or otherwise, is opposed to the idea of getting together with family and friends and offering thanks for what's good in our lives. It's a ritual I think we should all do more often. I think where, and I don't want to speak for David Vanderhoop, but I can speak for myself here, but what I take issue with is attaching that beautiful ritual to a false and I think damaging history. It's unnecessary. The ritual of getting together with family and friends does not need to be attached to this myth. And I should note that, for the better part of 200 years, even white New Englanders celebrated Thanksgiving without attaching the myth to it. So if we're going to invoke pilgrims and Indians every Thanksgiving season, I don't think there's any reason why we have to. I would contend that we need to get the story straight, warts and all. Because if we don't do that, we're doing damage to our Indigenous countrymen and women. And let me emphasize that, our countrymen and women, our fellow Americans, and no part of American society should be harmed by a national holiday. But we're also doing damage to everyone else too. We're doing damage to white people too, to white children who are being taught this lie, because it doesn't allow them to think critically about where we all came from, where we are, and where we're going. Historical truths are hard on everybody. They don't leave you feeling all that optimistic about how past generations behaved. And they don't necessarily lead to patriotism. What they do is they allow us to think more critically. And I would hope that many of us would agree that we could all use a better critical eye in our civic life these days.
Can you repeat the question one more time so I can make sure that I'm concise?
Yes, the question is if we don't celebrate Thanksgiving as we do today, what should we do?
Oh my. What I feel would be appropriate is to just ask that question. Knowing now that you know the truth, why not share that truth with others so that they can do what they want with it, but understand that you are coming from, and you understand that whoever asked that question, you understand that truth, and you either agree with that truth or you want to fall back on the myth and just turn a blind eye to what has happened right here where your home is, where your house is, where you go to work, where where your family is. I think that if you're brave enough, and it does take courage, I think that if you're going to be courageous and just be able to take a stand and look at your neighbor or another Wampanoag person in the eye, then you say, this year, this holiday represents this to me, the truth of how the immigrants actually stole and took this land by force. And I'm sorry for that. I acknowledge that and I apologize for that. To you, my family, to the Wampanoag people, and to the Indigenous people of this country.
So Berta is asking, so much of this is based on what was written by the English. How much can we believe to be true?
It's not easy. We have to strike a balance. There's no question that English colonists could only perceive a slim aspect of Wampanoag life. And even then, what they were perceiving was through these blinders, which were colored by their own particular ethnocentrality. English people weren't interested in the lives of Wampanoag women. Well, there's half the population. They would dismiss Native spiritual beliefs as devil worship. They were mostly interested in military affairs, politics, and trade. And even then, they couldn't see what was going on behind the scenes in intertribal diplomacy and even tribal politics. So, that's a really problematic record to base this story on. But what's the alternative? The alternative is not to include Native people in our history at all. So we need to tell a history based on flawed sources if we're going to include people other than white elites. And by the way, that includes white women and poor white people and African slaves, right? Most of those people didn't generate their own records. And the people who did generate records about them couldn't see them holistically. Now, I should emphasize here, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. There were English people who knew the Wampanoags and other Native people well, who spoke their languages, who slept over their houses, who welcomed Wampanoag people into their homes, who had sex with them, who dreamed in the Wampanoag language, they knew it so well, who tried to convert them, and so engaged in intense conversations about religion and philosophy and ethics, who traded with them year after year after year. And so let's not paint all colonists with one broad brush. There were some of them who could understand these people with a level of depth that I think we don't appreciate always. I think we should also understand that Wampanoag people had a way of making their opinions known in the colonial record, opinions that very often colonists did not want to hear. When you hear critiques of the colonial regime from Wampanoag people in the colonial record, that tells you you're onto something. We should also note that colonists didn't always see eye to eye on everything. There were rival colonies living next to each other. Massachusetts and Rhode Island didn't get along. Connecticut and Rhode Island didn't get along. The French and the Dutch didn't get along with the English. And Native people played those rivalries like a fine fiddle. And so we get various vantages on this history from those sources. So long story short, we do the very best we can with the flawed historical record, because the alternative is not including people whose histories and voices need to be included.
Just quickly, that's true. That's true. As a as a perspective, and yes, the history is way flawed, and it comes to us through those written documents that historians use, and that's that's how we have to interpret that. Now, now that is my point of when you are sitting around or walking down the street or wherever you are, you see a Wampanoag person and you greet them and you understand or try to make an understanding of how to do that, of how to greet them, of how to be walking on their land, understanding that they are the original people here. Put yourself in their shoes. If a Wampanoag people walked into your house during your Thanksgiving dinner today, a stranger, you can call the police on them, of course. But that's not, that may not be appropriate in whoever does that in their mind, because they're walking on their own territory. So it's hard. It's very hard to decipher and distinguish that history unless you are extremely want to get down to that extreme and talk to the Wampanoag people and try to understand and interpret the words beneath the words that are coming out from spirit, from that person that is a Wampanoag person. So it's hard. It just is hard, Berta. And I understand, I have that same question a lot.
So there are a couple more questions, but I want to keep to the time. And I know that we would like to close this out with you, David Vanderhoop, and sort of taking us to where do we go from here and how we go forward, which I know there were some questions that folks posed about that is how do we all go forward together? So I apologize to all of you who we couldn't get to some of the questions, but I'd love to just reserve the last couple of minutes to have you share with us on that.
Thanks, Anna. And just briefly, because I also want to give our other special guest, David Silverman, props, because he has done the work and he has been an ally and he has been doing the best that he can with what he understands, putting this down in the book and so on and so forth. And I would give you if you wanted just to briefly just have something to say in closing, Dave, which you could give us. I will conclude after your voice.
Thanks, David. Well, I just want to say this. History is hard on people. Historical truths are hard on people. I think they're hard on everybody. I think the truth about this particular history is hard on white Americans. I think it's hard on Native Americans too, because no one comes out of this story of violence and power politics and rivalry smelling like a rose. Treating historical actors of the past in three-dimensional form tends to make everyone today unhappy. to an extent, that's my job, right? And there's going to be a lot of unhappiness moving forward as we as a pluralistic nation confront the truth about our collective past. For most of American history telling, the story has been the story of manifest destiny, the story about how God willed the United States to expand across the continent and for it to become a beacon of liberty, Christianity, and opportunity for the rest of the world. And there's still a massive portion of the American population that wants American history to be taught that way. But that's not true. That's not true. And I would contend that if we as a pluralistic country are going to move forward together in a healthier way, we need to tell a history that allows all the elements of American society, all the communities of American society to see themselves in that history and to know that they're being told the truth. If white people are going to be more responsive to people of color in this country, they need to confront that history in all of its difficult truths. To do so is not to call on people to feel guilty. Guilt isn't going to get you anywhere. But what I would say is this: think of our country as the house that we've all inherited. Anytime you inherit a house, there are repairs that need to be made. And if you don't tend to those repairs, the rot will spread and undermine the foundation of the house. You don't need to feel guilty about those repairs, but you do need to acknowledge the need to make those repairs. And the lies we've told as a society in the way that we teach history are part of addressing those lies is part of making those repairs. And so, we have a lot of work to do. Taking Native American history seriously turns the patriotic themes of American history inside out. And it often takes people that generations have considered to be heroes and reveals their flaws. And that's hard. And yet it will enable us to move better. And let me be frank, I think avoid a repetition of the last 4 years. If we understand that difficult history, that's my hope for the future.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Dave. Appreciate it. So in moving forward, I believe that it is my responsibility to hold that truth, to promote that truth as I do every single day, as I do at Sassafras Earth Education when I'm talking to the youth there, to make that understanding that number one, that this Noepe, Martha's Vineyard, as it's now called, it's Wampanoag territory. And the people, children, families were here for thousands of years, living in harmony with what was on the land, and not just taking, and not just being irresponsible with that. So moving forward, I'd say it's paramount that each and every one of us today reaches deep inside to that truth that's in them, being who they are from where their ancestors have been. First being proud of themselves, but not being proud of the situation that their ancestors have put on them to bring this truth forward. If you're not Wampanoag. So during these next few weeks, where families gather in celebration to give thanks, an expression of thanks to the first peoples of Turtle Island, this land where we live today, is that first step of acknowledgement of what went on wherever you are, that, and however you decide to bring that truth, whether it's graphic or whether it's just a truth that we were here, because we're all walking on the blood of my ancestors, of the indigenous people of this land. And it still, to this very day, it still hurts me when I'm reading these books, when I'm going through this history, understanding that historic trauma and what I have to get through to be able to be here with you today and not be angry and not cuss and not just freak out, because that post-trauma situation lives in my body, as many people who have gone to war understand. That we just have to be understanding with each other to be able to move on and to pass on to the next generation the truth that we need to live together. And we need to be enhancers of our Mother Earth instead of taking whatever we can to gain the material things that we all want in this society. So I ask that you be truthful and honest with yourself and your families this season, and to acknowledge and stop stuffing the lies down their throats of how this country was originated and what they did. But just be honest. And that's a beginning. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so thankful to be born at this time and to be able to share with you and to be able to understand that somehow, some way, in the next generations to come, that we will be as one, as we should be, with Earth and with our ancestors. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you, David. There is great hope in our future. On behalf of the museum, I want to extend our great thanks to both of you for being here, for sharing with us, and for all of those who are participating and watching right now. Thanks to all of you. We're wishing you all continued health, safety, and brighter days ahead as we continue to learn and face and reckon. I wish you all a good night, and thanks again for everything this evening.